Alright folks, today I'd like to explore a question that has more than likely crossed your mind once or twice over the last 15 years while watching The Walking Dead. What the hell happened to the president, and by extension the rest of the US government? Now, full disclosure, as many of you probably already know, this question does not have a definitive answer as of the most recent project, being Daryl Dixon's Season 2. But by looking at some of the smaller details across the franchise, we can start to make some educated guesses on where they could have went. So today, I'm going to discuss what could have happened to them after the initial outbreak, why they haven't appeared since, and what that can mean for the future. Now, the world of The Walking Dead has always claimed to resemble our world to a T, with the only exception being the lack of zombies in media. So you'd naturally assume this guy was president at the time of the outbreak, right? Well, come season 11 of the main show, we learned things weren't quite so one-to-one after all. You see, the Commonwealth, a city with a population of over 50,000 by the year 2020, was established by the former president of the United States, William Milton, who is speculated to have won the 1980 American election and could have served from 81 to as late as 89. Which obviously tells us there are more discrepancies in our timeline than just zombies not existing. However, a line from Madison in Fear the Walking Dead mentions how she voted for Clinton. So it's kind of up to you to decide if it was Obama in office at the time or a fictional character like William Milton. Regardless, for the sake of the video, I will just refer to them as the president rather than anything definitive. Now, given we know some influential politicians such as the Miltons or Monroes were escorted by the military to safe zones when things went wrong, I personally think it would be silly to assume the president died on Monument Day. They would have been protected at all costs while being directed to a safe point, more than likely via air, so we can probably rule death out of the question. We see, via Lydia's flashbacks, the federal emergency broadcast system was activated, as it ran for a 24-day loop before shutting down and replacing itself with a please stand by message indefinitely. Sure, it could be assumed this was due to automation, but if we're sticking with the theory the president and other key officials survived, I think it would make a lot of sense if it was shut down manually, considering orders were approved to execute healthy civilians pretty early on as well. From my understanding, the president is the only person who can authorize a nuclear strike, which is exactly what we see play out on August 27th in the webisode Dead in the Water, as Chicago is specifically targeted. And although the crew aboard refused to fire onto their own country, the same couldn't be said about the Air Force, as on September 8th, 12 days after the initial outbreak, contingency plans for Operation Cobalt were approved by what's assumed to be the US president, leading to mass evacuations from metropolitan areas for soldiers as helicopters were sent in to firebomb the cities 2 days later, which was followed by radio silence from the federal government as servicemen across the country scrambled back to the various military bases awaiting further orders that would never come, before eventually dying out like all the rest. Simply put, these events tell us somebody was authorizing these strikes as late as 2 weeks after the outbreak, meaning there had to have been some form of government stability remaining that reached safety before going quiet. In my opinion, it's a bit naive to think the president or their cabinet had no means to communicate with survivors from where they were, even after the damage to the infrastructure following the bombings of the major cities. I mean, they're the government, so unless everyone in power spontaneously died within hours of Operation Cobalt, we can only assume it was a choice to remain covert and ride it out in secret. But that would still leave the question of where exactly they went after the dead began to walk, and why they haven't been seen in the nearly 2 decades since. We know, after seeing The Ones Who Live, the CRM truly believed themselves to be the strongest force in the country, if not the world post-outbreak, due to their dominance of the wasteland via air. So you would think they would find remnants of the US government during their travels at some point over the years. What gives? Well, logically, this was simply because they didn't want to be found, as I believe they were, and more than likely still are, living underground. In our world, given a cataclysmic event were to occur, continuity of government sites such as Raven Rock or Mount Weather, among presumably dozens of other undisclosed bases, have been established to ensure the protection of key officials. Despite the minor discrepancies in our timelines, I'd say it's safe to assume the federal government in the Walking Dead universe had a similar system in place. So without a doubt, I believe the remnants of the US government is very much still active in one of these undisclosed locations, remaining hidden and undisrupted by the surface while operating as instructed. But by Dead City's timeline, which could be as far as 18 years into the outbreak depending on who you ask, we've seen full-on societies form to the point where the world has begun to resemble how it once did more and more. So, assuming this theory is correct, why haven't they come out yet? Operations such as Padre were put into place to assure someone in association with the federal government was attempting to rebuild after a calamity. But since they failed their job miserably and evolved into some weird kid cult, the only factions left on the surface are those built from the flames of their old government's devastating actions. Until recently in the timeline, the Civic Republic military was a powerhouse operating without consequences. Having been formed from the remnants of the Pennsylvania National Guard following the Second American Civil War, which saw their forces fight off Operation Cobalt to save Philadelphia, the Civic Republic military had initially viewed the federal government as monsters before ironically executing similar heinous orders through gas attacks. With their rise in numbers, strength, and influence, I'd theorize what's left of the federal government was aware of the Civic Republic's operations over the years wherever they were, but due to their decision to let their army perish above ground without direction, they wouldn't have the strength to stop their growth and dominance without devastating any more of the country and killing a large chunk of the remaining population. So they remained put and continued to operate as instructed in isolation while new factions continued to rise in power. TLDR, the surviving president and government officials waited too long to come out and were too scared to face the now powerful and angry CRM due to letting their army die, and didn't want to use nukes because the last time they fired on their own people, it just created an even worse monster. However, come the end of the CRM's malevolent reign by Rick and Michonne's hands, perhaps we'll begin to see this change. I've been looking to the future a lot lately in my recent videos, and an idea I keep coming back to is the formation of a new United States. Each of the independent factions we've been seeing are growing in influence, and at this point in the timeline, I'm inclined to believe most have figured out the cycle of violence only leads to the destruction of everything that's been built. We have no idea what the federal government would look like at this point. Perhaps whoever was president maintained all authority even till this day, or maybe they were overthrown or re-elected at some point after the outbreak. But what I do know is, whenever they decide to come out, whoever it is in power won't stand by and simply say, "Good job guys," and move on to start some new colony. They would try to take over what's already been established while enforcing their own definition of order across the new states, which is my sneaky way of bringing you a universe endgame theory. Given everything I've said comes to be, with the various colonies expanding while new ones establish themselves through trade and law over the next few years, I think the concept of the old world government returning to reclaim their country after letting the people do the work would be a wild finale for the universe, whether that came as a movie or some spiritual season 12 spin-off. Who exactly would come out of these bunkers? Would they be accepting of the colony's ways of governing themselves? Or would they insist on establishing an old world federal system while enforcing their laws universally? And in my opinion, one of the more interesting questions, how would the people feel about the government who bombed them returning to take over? There are so many stories you can make out of this scenario, but what are some other possibilities as to their whereabouts and intentions? Well, perhaps the president, along with the rest of the remaining government, did initially take shelter in these bunkers, but have fled to other countries or islands in the time since. Daryl Dixon proposed the idea of the UK surviving the initial outbreak, so perhaps this was where they went following Operation Cobalt. But judging by the Daryl Dixon Season 2 finale and Season 3 trailer, it doesn't look to still be in stable condition if you ask me. Alternatively, I'd like to direct your attention to a pretty obscure piece of the Walking Dead media. You see, during the airing of Fear Season 2, AMC released a series of webisodes titled Radio Waves. One of my favorites being Conspiracy Theory, which features an unknown man claiming the government themselves were responsible for the outbreak altogether, stating it was a failed attempt at population control that went awry. However, the most interesting bit of information this man claims to have found is the constant use of the acronym NOAA in their files that he believes means they took off into the sky and left them. Now, everything about this clip is made out to be crazy nonsense, but maybe that's just what they want you to think. But in all seriousness, the man doesn't state where or how he came across any of this information, and as of now, nothing within has been elaborated on in the 8 years since its release. Regardless, it could explain why they were so quick to leave the world to die, as they created it and knew it couldn't be stopped. But hey, that's just a theory. A dead theory, I guess. So what do you guys think? Did everyone actually die, and am I just talking nonsense? Was the virus a government experiment gone wrong? Is the president, along with other key officials, alive and well underground, or do you think they're somewhere else? This idea of government reclamation is ripe with potential for future stories, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on everything we've discussed today in the comments down below. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.